This opposition of digital and craft is, if I may say so, a very dangerous one. It assumes that the era that we're now entering, digital era, is a time which puts behind the traditions and the modalities of performing a craft. And basically, I think that's wrong, that we have to look at the digital as a new form of craftsmanship. And I came to this after my book was published, because I was contacted by a group of programmers whom I'd mentioned very briefly in my book. These were programmers for Microsoft who had started a movement called Craft in Code. That is, how do you program as a craftsman? And I'd heard about them. I mentioned it in my book. They read the book, and they invited me to come meet with them. Most of them, by the time my book is published, had left Microsoft, and that's a very important datum, because they couldn't pursue craft as code in what is a kind of monopoly of mediocre product. I hope there's nobody here from Microsoft. And we're trying different ways to work, doing good quality work as programmers in a different context. And I went to see them. They were in San Francisco, out in Seattle, where Microsoft is located, in smaller firms, many of which invoke the notion of a workshop, like an artisan's workshop. One of them was called Artisanale, misspelled, with an I rather than an E on the end. Wonderful, no matter. In talking to them, what became clear to me was that the reference for them was as code, not as an object, but as a performance. That is, that what is happening in the digital world is that the just production of physical code is something that is seen as neutral. And for them, the kind of coding which enters the realm of craft is something which has elements of display, play, repetition. It reminded me very much of the kind of craftsmanship that's involved in playing music. I am, by training, a musician. And so I began to rethink a little some of the thoughts that I'd had in my own book about this relationship between what seems like a very dry technical procedure, writing code, and performance. And that's what I'm going to describe to you a little today. And that's why I'm a little worried about your title, Craft in the Digital Age. It should be Craft of the Digital Age. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is not an opposition. It's something that is going to happen in digital culture. To maybe make this what I'm going to say a little more concrete. You need to know that in English, we make a distinction between craft and craftsmanship. A craft is usually thought of as a manual activity, and craftsmanship is thought of as quality of work, and more than that, doing good work for its own sake. So craftsmanship implies a kind of degree of objectification, not merely of production. Whereas a craft could be merely a productive activity. Craftsmanship is a quality that's embedded in the making. And the great drama about craftsmanship is how it is that quality gradually gets built up in a productive act. And I just signal three aspects of this from my book that I think are relevant to this. First, is that, do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, when we think about craftsmanship, we're thinking about something as of good quality, and how do we arrive there? How does something become better in quality? And here, my discussions with these people in these coders, these programmers, they weren't coders, they were programmers, resonated to me with three aspects of the work that I know, in the craft I know best, which is a performance. I used to, in the days when I could play well, I was a cellist, still hack it a little bit. And I was reflecting that there are three ways in which there's an overlap between digital craftsmanship and traditional musical craftsmanship about becoming more skilled. The first of these is that there is a rhythm of skill development in both. And if I could have afforded it, I would have brought you my cello to show you one activity. This is called a vibrato, and it's a way of, I should reverse it. No, I'll do it this way so you can see it, okay? If I were holding the cello, it would be happening here. But it's a way of coloring a note by changing the pitch very, very slightly by movements of the hand or the wrist, sometimes the shoulder. When young cellists first, or young violinists, first learn vibrato, they're very aware of what they're doing, because it's a very hard movement, actually, because you have to stay on the note so that it feels in tune, even though you're introducing this minor distortion into the sound framework. And so they have to think about it very, very carefully. And after a while, with a young musician, what will happen is that they've mastered one technique for making a vibrato, and they stop thinking about it. In other words, a practice which began as explicit knowledge becomes tacit. We use the word habit about this. It's not habitual in the sense that it's routine, but you no longer, as a musician, need to think, I need to vibrate here. You simply know it at a certain moment. For instance, when notes are long, or when something needs a color, that you're going to do that. The problem becomes that what you have first learned is one technique for doing this. At a certain moment, as your skill, the music you're playing becomes more challenging, you learn that you need different kinds of vibrato. I don't know how much well, I just tell you it. I hope you can hear it in your head. The difference between the vibrato and the first measure of the Schumann cello concerto and the opening of the Dvorak cello concerto is a difference between a vibrato that's made here or a vibrato that's made here. This is Schumann, this is Dvorak. And when you come across at a certain point in your development about learning to play, and you see that the vibrato that works for Schumann is no good for Dvorak, you need to do something else. At that point, there is a kind of explicit unpacking of the activity. What was formerly tacit becomes dredged into explicit consciousness because there's a resistance. That is, something isn't right. It's not that you, Dvorak, well, I'll do it this way. Something has to go wrong for the person, cellist, to think, I have to think about what to do here. Once that process happens of sort of reconsidering and re-exploring, the difference between an elbow vibrato and a wrist vibrato becomes something that then again disappears into the tacit realm. As I say, it's not habit in the sense that it's mechanical, but it is a technique which has now become variegated. And this is the rhythm of one rhythm of skill development. It's a movement from tacit knowledge, which is inscribed as a practice, to something explicit, which is a practice which is reconsidered, and the creation of a new practice which is added along to the old, and which is no longer something you have to think about. The reason this is so important is that much of the writing about craftsmanship assumes there's one right way to do something, right? You see a slow note, you vibrate, right? In fact, this is wrong. This is only for the worst kind of amateur would play, if they could even manage 2 measures of it, would play the Dvorak and the Schumann in the same way. But it applies to all kinds of craftsmanship. When we say we develop a skill, it is that we learn many ways to perform the same kind of activity, which means there's no one right way. And what that means philosophically is that something becomes an objective practice without being a truth practice. Do you understand what I mean? In other words, it's by the time you can do what I used to be able to do, I have lots of kinds of vibratos, that the objective practices that you can command are not, this is the way I should do it, but rather, there are many ways to get at something, and these are choices which are not something that happens as a one right way to do something. This is why for musicians, when we go on the road and play concert after concert, I think I've played the dissonant quartet, I don't know, maybe 100 times. It's always different because that notion of experiment with something, different ways to do something, is there, and it's there in me without having to think, let's try something different. The point I'm trying to make to you about this is that there's a difference between a craft practice and a mechanical practice, which is a correlation between means and ends, in which there's only one correlation. Now, when I started talking to my programmers about this, they said, well, of course, that's what all good quality programming is about. I know nothing about programming. I mean, I can barely turn on my computer. But they said, look, it's the same sort of thing. You can arrive at the programming, for instance, one activity on a computer by many routes. That is, there are many ways to do the same thing. But the process of getting to that for the computer programmer to learn that is a trial and error method in which resistance is the most important thing in making people think about what they're doing. So, do you understand what I mean? That, to them, that's music. That you encounter resistance, you think about what you're doing, and you reinscribe it, and you go back to programming in another way. So that is the rhythm of skill development, which takes us out of the notion that there's one right way to do something, and that a technique is getting better at doing the same thing over and over again. In music, the way that translates is, if you can't do lots of, I keep wanting to show you in the way you can see it. If you can't do lots of different kinds of vibratos, if you don't learn that, any particular way of vibrating goes stale, because it's just a monochromatic phenomenon. Implicit in this is the second thing that I want to tell you about how a skill development occurs. And that is a relation between problem finding and problem solving. In the mechanical view of craft, that when you encounter a problem, you solve it. End of story. In other words, that the attributes often used to describe craftsmanship, mastery, Stradivarius knew exactly what to do. This is garbage, because in solving a problem, new kinds of problems emerge simply because you can't do it. If any of you are pianists, you will know that solving the problem of tucking a thumb as we move in the scale produces, at the end of an octave, a whole different problem, which is how then to move from octave to octave, because the thumb has tucked itself under one finger. Say, if you think about a C major scale, it's tucked itself under this finger, but when it gets to the end of that scale, it has to do a different kind of motion. And multiplied 1,000 times, this is the problem that we face in craftsmanship, which is that because we can do one thing, other things become problematic for us. And when we cut off this relationship between problem solving and problem finding, we kill our technical abilities. I've often thought about this in academic life with these multiple choice tests, where you put in the right answer. And I've often thought that the really intelligent people taking those multiple choice tests are the ones who get the wrong answer because it's interesting. There's a problem there. There's something intriguing. Whereas the ones who, 2 + 2 = 4, end of story, are never going to think about non-Euclidean geometries or non-Euclidean non-Euclidean forms of addition. You know, why would you? You've solved a problem. And it's the same thing, I think, in all good craft work. And it's, again, one of the reasons that we repeat over and over and over again, because as we get better, I'm sure this is true for potters, or for painters, for that reason. We learn how to do something, and that means a new terrain has opened up to us. Now, what's interesting to me in talking to these computer programmers was something I don't understand, but I will report to you. Maybe some of you understand this much better. They say that is the difference between a Linux open source program and the Microsoft program. That a Microsoft program closes so that when you solve a problem, it doesn't open a new terrain to you. But with an open source programming kernel like Linux, when you learn how to do one thing, you see other things that need to be explored. So again, this is something where there's craft in the digital, right? The craft of the digital, rather than craft being inserted within a kind of digital envelope, which is antithetical to it. And I think it's a basic rhythm for all kinds of development. That, in other words, again, it's a taking away of the, in mathematical terms, of the Boolean notion that there's truth. You know, you arrive at something, you have closure, 2 + 2 is 4, end of story. That's a Boolean way of thinking, whereas in a Bayesian way of thinking, you would think that, well, if that's true, then what follows from that? Maybe it's not entirely true. Maybe there are some conditions in which 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. That is how mental life in general develops. But it's certainly true in the craft world that I know best, in music. And I just say inter alia about that, when I teach young cellists how to play, when I see that they're really happy with something, that is the moment when I'm a very nice teacher, but when I see that they're really self-satisfied, they finally taped it, you know, that's when I pounce, because that is a point to say, you can do that, but that only opens up a whole other set of problems that you now are equipped to address. The idea about this psychologically is that catharsis in a craft is a very, very partial thing. You have to feel, I'm getting better, I can do it. But the notion that there is a complete catharsis is something that is paralyzing to this process of using problem solving as a way to find problem solving. The third thing I want to say to you about the development of craft skill is its time. The essential thing about all craft work is it's slow. And I mean, it seems simple, stupid to say this. But slow is something that you have to learn to do. That is, to do something incredibly slowly. It's often B flat. Anyhow, if any of you have been forced to do piano scales, I hope that you have learned what I'm going to say to you about this, which is the only way to learn a scale right is to slow it down slower and slower and slower. The faster you do something, the less even the scale is going to be. There's a mental reason for this, which is that when you slow a practice down, what you are doing is allowing a break, a slight break, in which the consciousness of the activities in a sequence comes to the fore. It's a mini version of this tacit explicit. The explicit is also always in slower time than it is in fast time. So again, to come back to the example of taking a multiple choice test, we reward people who can give all the answers in a multiple choice test, which means they go as fast as possible, which means that there's no actual consideration of how an activity is constituted. Now, slow time has a philosophical aspect to it. And I should say also, the thing about slow time is that the instant hit is something that is the privilege of that is diminished. By an instant hit, I mean sometimes when you're reading a piece of music, you've done it all right. You just got there. You were fast. You read the whole thing. That's what we do in sight reading. But instant hits are things that people tend not to be able to repeat. The experience we have is often that there are exceptions to what I'm going to say, but the general experience we have is that people who are very facile sight readers aren't very good at practicing because they got there too fast. It's difficult for them to practice over and over again and actually dwell in the things they do. The time of slow is incredibly important. There is a philosophical side to this, and that is to dwell in something means not what Heidegger thinks of as dwelling as a form of immersion in which ultimately there's a release. This famous part of Sein und Zeit where he talks about the notion that when you're slow, finally there's a kind of surrender in a practice. It's much more the kind of slow time that Henri Bergson imagined, which is a space of durée in which things can be looked at and can be considered consciously. There's a big difference between them. For Heidegger, there's a kind of catharsis when you dwell in something slowly, where gradually you become absorbed and you are at peace. For Bergson, when things are slow, you're less at peace. The slower they are, the less are you confident about what you're doing. And that, I think, is true for most artists when we're practicing, when we're getting better, that we inhabit the time of durée rather than the time of a surrender to being. This also is something, believe it or not, that matters in the computer world. One of the reasons my craft and code programmers left Microsoft was that Microsoft wants to get the most code written in the shortest space of time it can. That's its productive imperative. Produce code fast. And then you can correct the code through user feedback. I don't think I want to go any farther into telling you the level of mediocrity that these, what are called premature releases, produce. Actually, I do. I mean, the reason why, because it's why many of these people quit working for Microsoft and firms like it. Because the pressure to go fast diminishes the whole attentiveness to what's being produced. The feedback from customers is something that puts a burden on the customer of explaining something that's going wrong, but at a very minimal level. The craftsman isn't dealing with that, but the consumer is. And if I said to you, you know, well, you found that suddenly you erased a document. What were you doing to erase it? You could only give me the most impressionistic view of that. And so that the whole process of feedback mechanism breaks down through this system of production. The feedback is of low quality, and the products remain therefore of low quality. And this is most dramatic in Microsoft 10, a version which is, according to my informants, is absolutely dysfunctional because it was produced like that. You know, they needed the money. They needed to sell a new version. And we know what the result was. So, in other words, what I've described to you is three practices which make a kind of parallel between the musical and the digital. The first of them is this rhythm of tacit, explicit, tacit in performance. The second is the relation of problem solving to problem finding. In other words, the notion that this is not a Boolean system of closure, not a system of one-to-one correspondence. And finally, the time of craftsmanship, which is a slow time. And slow is what produces quality. God, I'm very long-winded on this subject. Can I say that I think one of the reasons that, if you think about this correspondence between these two things, that people have an intuitive idea that this is not an age of craftsmanship, is not that craftsmanship is unproductive, or that, you know, baking bread by hand is going to be replaced by baking bread by machine. That, I think, is a trivial way to look at the problem. The problem is that capitalism, as we know it, increasingly today, has no interest in craftsmanship. That is, it is a productive activity which has fixed products, which do not invite the user to become ever more skilled in their use. When you think about, for instance, a user-friendly program, you know, as an invitation to buy a piece of digital software, you're thinking about something which is stupefying. You don't have to think about it. The analogy, and it's a perfect analogy, is teaching somebody to play the violin or the piano or any other musical instrument by the Suzuki Method, which is, it tells you exactly what to do. The kids love it because right away you can play all that music, but you can never get better. And in the so-called digital revolution, what we're seeing is the fact that simplicity is a draw for use, means that the objects themselves contain a rather mediocre level of functioning which cannot be enhanced by the user. the user cannot become a craftsman. Do you follow me what I'm saying about this? And what my new colleagues, my new friends in the digital world have said to me about this is that the kinds of open source things like Linux, which invite the user to become more skilled, are something that are niche markets for certain users. That the massification of use has meant a kind of stasis in the performance of the digital, both on the side of the programmers and on the side of the users. So that to me is the big issue here, that this digital revolution is something that, once we think of it as a problem in craftsmanship, looks a lot different than the notion that you can make a pot by hand. It is that it is disempowering of craftsmanship in that sense of a practice, of a performance. So that's what I would like to talk to you about. I'd like to end this talk with something that doesn't really have to do with the digital and the physical, but is, since I wrote my book, a big issue about this. And that is a relation of art and craft. And I made the argument in my book that if you wanted to weigh up the ethical value of artistic work and craftsmanship, that craftsmanship is far more important than artistic activity. That seemed, for some odd reason, to bring people out in hives, make them very unhappy. It seemed to be very self-evident. So I'd like to just explain, although this is slightly off the topic, but we're in a museum of craft rather than art. I want to show you why I think this is where you should be focusing your energies rather than in a picture gallery. The notion of the 19th century notion of the cult of the artist was somebody who made something where before there was nothing. That is, that the work of art was something new, unique, and that derives from the idea that, in Latin, in Greek, the origins of the word poetry, poiesis, to make, and the notion that the derivative of that was that if in that original thing that you made something which before there was nothing. That's what poein means. That became in the 19th century the notion that an artist is stepping out of the tradition of a workshop, an established practice, and doing something different. And gradually, that became the notion that a work of art is something that breaks the conventions of practice. That is, that it's something that makes an epistemic break. That's gotten into the digital world. Actually, this is related to what I was saying before. I take it back. That's gotten into the digital world in the notion, the incredible emphasis put on innovation. That is, that something is good because it's an innovation, it's new. That's a reflection of sort of 19th century bourgeois ideas about making art. And it means that in innovation, you have to have it. you have to get that iPad Pro, even though it really doesn't do anything different than the first iMacs, because it looks so good, it looks so different. You must get an iPhone 6 Plus, right? That's a kind of commercialization of a bourgeois, in my view, of a bourgeois notion about art that begins in the 19th century. And the reason why I say that's less, it weighs less in the scales than craft work, is because craft work is about additive skill, craftsmanship. It's about building on what you know rather than throwing it out. Do you understand what I mean? Everything I've described to you in this little talk is about something which is not progressive in the sense of progress with a big P, but is additive, that you build on your skills. But the capitalist logic of having you throw it out and buy something new is that what was there before is used up. Right? When you learn how to use it, it's dead, almost. It's the same reason people buy ever new models of automobiles. Even though you can, well, I don't drive, but even though, you get around perfectly well on a Vespa. But the logic of this is a logic that privileges the creative act over the craftsman's act. It also has a sociological dimension, because innovation is something that separates the innovator from the mass, whereas craftsmanship is a collective activity. You don't do it alone, you learn it from other people. Most craftsmen work in workshops, whether they're Silicon Valley offices that reek of pizza and 6 people there spending 18 hours a day working on something. But it's a collective activity. I'm always put in mind of this by a statement by Franz Liszt, who's the epitome of what I'm talking about, who said, the concert is myself. It's an amazing statement. That is, that what you're dramatizing is this single extraordinary performer. Now, I say all of this because I feel that we have, particularly there are wonderful artists. I'm not putting it down. Well, I am, but that's all right. But what we've done is given the notion of innovation, of creating something new, the value of the epistemic break, right? We've given in our culture this a value that slights the work that's collective, additive, I think non-capitalistic, of craftsmanship and craft labor. And to really recover that social world of craftsmanship, I think we have to break an attitude that is really enracinated on the other side about creativity being a form of individuation or separation. Because everything I've described to you today is not a form of creativity. It's not creativity in the sense of something where before there was nothing. It's a different way of making quality, building quality into practices and into objects.